Hello, my name is Dan Ebner, and I'd like to walk you through some slides on strategic leadership. Specifically, I'd like to take you through the 8 steps that were written up in a book written by my friend and colleague, Fred Smith, and myself, entitled Strategic Planning: An Interactive Process for Leaders, published by Paulus Press. So yes, the world desperately needs new leaders because the world needs change. And quite frankly, the world needs to take a look at its definition of leadership because too often it's considered simply a position of authority. The textbook definition of leadership would suggest that it's about an interactive relationship between leaders and followers, depicted on the left side of your screen by these two arrows going both ways, meaning that communication's got to move in multiple directions for it to be leadership. And it's really intended to bring about some kind of change. In this particular case, we're going to be looking at change as the common goal or the shared vision that's required in leadership. So in the industrial model of leadership, leadership was seen as simply good management. Good managers were leaders. Leaders and managers were seen as synonymous. Workers were seen as subordinates, which means subordinary, and workers needed to be supervised, overlooked. Motivation was seen as simply a paycheck instead of the intrinsic kind of motivators that we're thinking about today. And strategic planning was a mountaintop experience. That mountaintop experience in strategic planning was reserved for the select few, the people at the top, the people in positions of authority, senior executives who would go to the top of this mountain for 3 or 4 or 5 days and come down the mountain 3 or 4 or 5 days later with a 5 to 10 year strategic plan. Totally different from today. Today's metaphor, I would suggest, is more like whitewater rafting. We're coming down that mountain together. We're all in the same boat together. We've got to trust each other to make quick decisions based on simple rules and core values and strategic plans. Given the fact that the speed of change is increasing in our world, organizations need to become faster in their decision making. They need to become flatter, which means making more decisions on teams, and become more flexible, which means being willing to take some more risks and think innovatively outside that box. In the post-industrial model, where we're at today, leadership is now about adapting. It's about adapting to changes going on in the outside world. Leadership begins with a desire to change something. When you feel passionate about wanting to change something, and you begin to influence other people around you, you're leading. And in this post-industrial world, there's no set path for leaders. There's no easy answers for leadership. Entropy is a biological principle that suggests that every living organism, every plant, every animal, every human being is in the process of dying because of entropic forces in their environment. If we think of organizations as being living organisms, and I think we should, then they too need to reinvent, renew, and recreate themselves or suffer the result of entropic forces that will actually threaten their very survival. The Chinese symbol for crisis gives us some insight into this dynamic. It suggests that within every crisis, there's both danger and opportunity. There's danger, yes, risks need to be taken, and there's opportunity for leadership. So if we put all these pieces together, the task of leadership is about change. It's about a vision for the future. It's about creating strategies that take us into that future. Management, on the other hand, is about structure. The task of management is making sure that we have enough structure in our lives and enough life in our structures. It's about providing order in our organizations, and it's about attending to those day-to-day operations that are going to become even more important when we finish our strategic planning. So as you can see, we need the task of leadership and management for organizations to be both effective and efficient. On the relationship side, leadership is an interactive and voluntary relationship between leaders and followers. Leaders invite and inspire and influence people to join them in a change process. Management, on the other hand, is a position of authority. It's about assigning roles in an organization, providing control, and giving directions. Obviously, we need a good mix of both leaders and managers to do strategic planning. Strategic planning in our book has a subtitle called An Interactive Process for Leaders. We think that strategic planning provides an opportunity for leaders to provide interactive exercises where their people can be involved and participate in some kind of process that's going to lead the organization to change. Strategic planning is really about starting with now, the present, which is really about your mission, your purpose. Why do you exist as an organization? And then it's moving in the direction of the future. So the future is about vision, and vision is about direction. Strategy is the path that we take from the present to the future. If we see this strategy, this arrow, I'd like you to think about this bright blue box as being the box, the proverbial box that we want to think outside of. And as we think outside the box, we need to think inside a circle. And that circle is really dictated by what are the parameters of your organization. What are the organizational mandates? What are the rules and regulations you got to think about? What are some policies and procedures that might limit our thinking outside the box? But I would suggest there's lots of space outside that box, but inside the circle. And core values can provide some insights into determining or helping us figure out what's inside the box, what's outside the box, and what's inside or outside the circle. The main thing is we don't want to be thinking outside the parameters of that circle when we do strategic planning. So we don't want any strategies that follow that red dotted line on the bottom of the screen. We want to make sure that we are very clear as an organization. What are those parameters? What parameters are set that we can't think outside of? So to summarize, we want to have the courage to think outside the box of those familiar strategies that we've always tried before, but we want to think inside the circle. We have to be prudent enough to know where the limits are when we think outside that box. Now, when Fred and I first put our strategic planning model together, we had 16 boxes, and we thought this particular model was too complicated. So we simplified it down to these 8 steps, and our book has a chapter on each step in our process. Step 1, set the stage. This is where we plan to plan. We decide who's going to be involved. Fred and I like to suggest that we somehow encourage organizations to involve as many people as possible in strategic planning. Okay, both inside and outside the organization. We want to bring the outside in. We want community leaders. We want partners on the outside. We want some customers or clients to be involved in strategic planning. We want to get their insights, at least, their input into the strategic planning process. We also want to involve as many people as possible inside the organization, because the more people we involve inside the organization in the planning itself, the more people are going to buy into the result at the other end. Then we have to decide, what steps are we going to take? We have 8 steps in our process. Sometimes organizations go through all 8 steps. Sometimes maybe you shortcut some of those. Maybe you're just doing an update of your strategic plan. Where are you going to meet to get away from the distractions of the busy workplaces we have? And when are we going to meet? How often are we going to meet? How much time is it going to take? Fred and I suggest that in most organizations it takes about maybe 6 or 8 hours, and that's just where the strategic planning team comes together to do the strategic planning itself. And we like to divide that into maybe 2 sessions of 3 to 4 hours each, if that's possible. It depends on the organization. But hey, I've done strategic planning for 150 organizations, and no 2 are alike. We would suggest that the most important question to answer in this setting the stage step of the process is who's going to be involved? Who's going to be on the strategic planning team? We need a good mixture of people, leaders and managers and followers. We got to provide lots of opportunities for as many people to get involved as possible. And we're going to talk about ways of doing that. We also want to make sure that it's fun and interesting. We hear this from our clients all the time. People will say, gosh, I never knew strategic planning could be so fun. I didn't know it was so interesting. I wish I'd have known your process before, because I've been through strategic planning before that's been so boring. So we like to think that our interactive processes that are described in the book are what really can make strategic planning more fun, more interesting. You need a good complementary skill mix among the people coming. You want to have technical expertise, which means knowledge of the business. You got to have some people who've got interpersonal skills, because all these interactive exercises are going to require some good facilitation and good communication. And you want some problem solving skills, some people who can think innovatively, think creatively, think about some new ways of addressing these old problems we've got. So the bottom line is, we want to move from that mountaintop experience of the post-industrial era, and we want to make this process something where we take it into our offices. We want it to be on the main floor. We want interaction with our customers and interaction with each other. We want to involve all aspects of the organization in the strategic planning process. Our clients oftentimes tell us that strategic planning can be a team building activity. Okay, we go through the forming because we're going to get to know each other better. We're going to certainly go through storming because we got to get our conflict out on the table. We're going to do some norming when we articulate our core values and come up with new plans and strategies. And ultimately, it's about performing, because strategic planning is about implementation. That's what we really want to do, is we want to make sure that every step in our process improves the likelihood that you're going to implement your strategic plan. So we got to get the conflict out on the table. It's very important in strategic planning that we take real problems and put them on the table squarely and address them as an organization. Now, there's a difference between task conflict and relationship conflict. Research shows that task conflict is healthy in small and moderate amounts. It's healthy for teams and organizations. Task conflict is where you and I simply have a difference of opinion about how to solve a problem, or we have a different perspective on that problem. Okay, this is healthy. If we both are looking at the problem exactly the same way, we're probably missing something. Relationship conflict, on the other hand, is not healthy for teams or organizations. The research shows that it's dysfunctional. This is where task conflict escalates into a relational issue, where instead of attacking the problem, now we're attacking each other. So step 2, do your homework. This is a picture of a focus group. It's actually where I'm teaching how to do focus groups in Croatia, where I teach every year. So we like to do focus groups both internally and externally. We like to involve, maybe, in fact, in some organizations where we've done strategic planning, virtually every member of the organization is involved in a focus group before the strategic planning starts. We've worked with companies where every employee has been a part of a focus group before we get started. Now, we exclude the people who are going to be on the strategic planning team. But what we do is we hold these focus groups, we take furious notes, and then we make sure that all of that input gets to the strategic planning team before they get started. So in addition to the internal people, we like to have some customers, some clients, maybe some partners, some community leaders, people in the neighborhood. Get some people from the outside, bring the outside in, so that we get an internal perspective on what other people think about our organization and where we ought to be headed. Another way to think about doing our homework is to ask ourselves, what are the social, technological, economic, and political trends that are most affecting our business? Social trends would be things like the aging of our communities, the diversity, the demographics in our neighborhoods, what's going on with the family, the nuclear family, and how much single parenting is going on in our particular world. What about levels of stress and levels of education? Do people have the job skills that we need for our particular business? Technological trends. Look at how cell phones have changed our world in the last 5 to 10 years. Look how important it is to use social media and to make sure that we have interactive websites these days. Consider the security issues that people are having, like with credit cards, or the distractions that all these technological gadgets are creating in our workforce. Okay, these are some of the technological trends that we want to look at before we start strategic planning. Look at the economy. What's going on with the poverty rate? How's the stock market affecting our business? What about employment, underemployment, unemployment? What's happening with the middle class? What kind of competition is there for dollars? What's going on in our world? What's going on in our state? What's going on in our locality? What's going on in our neighborhood? What's happening economically? And then the political trends. Who are our allies? Who are our adversaries? Who are some of our stakeholders? How are partisan politics affecting us as a business? What about government spending? Does that affect us as an organization? What about the turf protection going on in the political arena and the increased scrutiny, which is requiring us to do more paperwork? These are just some of the political trends that we want to consider before we enter into strategic planning. The main thing here, the bottom line, is to think strategically. We need hindsight into the past, we need insight into the present, and we need foresight into the future. And we've got to make sure that everybody's looking at what's the big picture of things. We also think it's important to make the whole strategic planning process as interactive as possible. So we like to use conversation cafes, the snow card technique, and a core values process that we've created and we've described in the book. Let me start with conversation cafes. This is actually a picture of a conversation cafe taking place on a barge. Yep, I do strategic planning for Living Lands and Waters. They clean up rivers in the Midwest and on the East Coast. And this is a picture of people engaged in a conversation cafe. You can see that they're looking at and writing on charts in the middle of the table. And you can see people at different tables. And what we do in conversation cafes is we rotate people around the room so that they get an opportunity to write at each chart on all the tables in the room. They're doing it in small groups, but everyone in the room eventually gets to each table so that everyone's input is provided and each particular topic. That's a conversation cafe. One way of doing a conversation cafe is with a SWOT analysis. So let's say, for example, we're going to do our SWOT with a conversation cafe. And let's say we've got 4 tables with maybe 16 people on the strategic planning team. And so we've got 4 people at each table. And we put a chart in the middle of each table, one with the word strengths, another with the word weaknesses, and then opportunities and threats. That's what we mean by a SWOT. So strengths and weaknesses are internal and present. What are we good at? What could we be better at? Opportunities and threats are future-oriented and they're external. They're things outside our control. Opportunities to grow the company, threats to that growth. Okay, those are things outside our control. It's important to emphasize that to people when you do a SWOT analysis. But in the conversation cafe, you're going to rotate everybody in the room to each one of these tables. And each particular group is going to have a different colored marker. So we can track each comment back to the group that wrote it down. Eventually, we rotate everyone back to the original table where they started. After they've been to all 4 tables, they go back to their first table and they look for themes in the data. They write those on the chart and then they post the chart on a wall. And we do a gallery walk, which basically means we walk around and look at this colorful artwork that we've created and ask ourselves, what are we good at? What are we not so good at? And what are the opportunities and threats in our particular environment? Active listening is very important to strategic planning. We need to eliminate the distractions that we might have if we try to do strategic planning too close to the workplace. We need to probe for clarification when we're having these kinds of discussions. We might ask a question like, tell me more about that, or can you help me understand what you mean by this? Summarizing what the other person has said is probably the most important communication skill in these interactive exercises. This means that we summarize what the other person has said to the point where they know that we understood what it is that they've already said. And then to confirm that what they've actually said is what we've heard. Okay, so you want to confirm understanding by asking the other person, did I get it right? Step 3, describe your culture. The picture on the left here shows the core values process that we use in this particular step. Mission and core values are the essence of organizational culture. Mission is about purpose. It answers the question, why do we exist as an organization? What social benefit do we provide to our neighborhoods and community? We would suggest that every organization, not-for-profits, for-profits, community organizations, public organizations, they all provide some kind of social benefit to the community. Core values can be divided into two categories. Expressive core values express the mission of the organization. It might be things like beauty. Instrumental core values are ones that describe the business of the organization. How do we do business, like collaborative or efficient or effective? Now, the core values process that we do starts by asking people to reflect on what are the core beliefs, the core values of this organization. They do that individually first, then they meet one-on-one with each other and come to a consensus around 5 core values. Then their twosome goes and meets up with another pair, creating a group of 4, and they have to come up with 5 core values that they come to a consensus about, and then write those on a chart along with their names and post that on a wall. Then when everyone's done, we ask each group to come up to their chart and explain to the rest of the group what they mean by those 5 core values. This is a very powerful process. This is people getting up and talking about their core values, their core beliefs. Not only does it help articulate and identify and clarify what the core values are, but in the process, it really builds much more commitment to those core values. Proprioception is a long word, a big word for self-perception. And one aspect of it is thinking about our thoughts. Strategic planning, I would suggest, is a time to be proprioceptive. It's a time to reflect on our thoughts and ideas about our organization, to become more introspective about what it is that we're doing and where ought we be going. How can we become more proactive instead of just reacting to everything that's going on in our world? And how can we become more strategic and grow in wisdom as we try to become more proprioceptive and think about our thoughts? Strategic planning is an opportunity for collective proprioception. This is a word I've created. It just means that we reflect on our thoughts together. We become more reflective and introspective about our thoughts and ideas as we share them with each other. And we become more proactive as a team and more strategic as an organization. And eventually, we grow in wisdom together. Okay, so here's where we're at so far. We've finished steps 1, 2, and 3. We've got 5 more steps to our process. Step 4, frame the questions. These are strategic questions that we want to frame so that it's going to lead to step 5, which will be answer these questions. The questions we want to frame are centered around strategic issues, which are the major questions, issues, or problems facing us as an organization. They're later going to become the strategic goals, providing the general outline of our strategic plan. So to identify strategic areas, we have to think strategically. This means that a strategic area has to be comprehensive enough to affect every part of the organization. It needs to be critical enough, meaning it's got to be both urgent and important. It's got to be changeable so that we can lead that change, and it's got to be within our control. One way of thinking about our strategic issues and identifying them is to go back to that SWOT and ask ourselves, okay, how do our strengths and weaknesses internally, how do they match up with the opportunities and threats that are in our outside world? Okay, so do we have strengths and weaknesses that position us to take advantage of the opportunities in our environment? And do we have strengths and weaknesses that position ourselves to protect ourselves against the threats? Okay, the threats would be obstacles to growth. The opportunities would be opportunities for growth. And the question here is, are we positioned well to grow as an organization as we look at our SWOT? Sometimes just looking at how are we positioned, how do those S and W's match up with the T's and O's, that helps us to identify what those strategic issues might be. Another way to think about this is asking ourselves, what's important to us as an organization, but not necessarily seen by our people as urgent? This would be the bottom left-hand quadrant of this time management tool. Now, it's a no-brainer to say that, okay, things that are urgent and important might very well be our strategic issues, but I would suggest that one of the things that leaders need to do in strategic planning is create more of a sense of urgency about things that are important but are not necessarily perceived as being urgent. So we need to create a sense of urgency around those things that we never get around to because, they're important, but they're not urgent enough for us to really devote enough attention to. These are the kinds of things that we've got to try to identify in strategic planning. What's important but not necessarily seen as urgent? And how can we then address those issues in our strategic plan? We like to suggest that we ask people in the small groups, go back to your tables and identify 2 or 3 questions, starting with 3 words. How can we? Okay, we want them to design these questions around what they think are the strategic areas. After they've looked at the SWOT, they've considered what's urgent, what's important, what's critical, changeable, what's within our control, all of those things. Now go back to your tables and identify 2 or 3 questions, starting with the words, how can we? For example, how can we reach young families in our community? How can we develop more of a culture of innovation? And how can we recruit, train, and support new leadership so that we've got more people leading the change in our organization? Eventually, these are going to be articulated as our strategic goals. And each strategic goal, we're going to identify strategies underneath those strategic goals. And under each strategy, we're going to eventually identify action steps. This is what we call our strategic cascade. So let me try a little bit of math here. If we come up with 3 strategic areas in this particular step, and let's say that eventually we come up with 3 strategies for each strategic area, and then eventually we come up with 3 action steps for every strategy, we'll have 27 new things to do when we get done with strategic planning. We think that's a pretty good number. Somewhere between 20 and 30 is about just right for most of the organizations that we've done strategic planning with. But we think that it's important at this point to make sure that we don't get tempted to add too many things at the front end. So let's say, for example, we come up with 5 strategic areas. Okay, that's a lot. And then let's say that we come up with 5 strategies for each of those strategic areas. Okay, that's going to be 25 strategies. And then let's say we come up with 5 action steps for each strategy. Now we do 5 times 25, we're at 125 new things to do. This is unrealistic for most organizations. So we insist at this point, right at the first part of identifying the strategic areas, we usually show this math and we say it's important for us to set priorities and try to limit ourselves to about 27 action items by getting to this 3 times 3 times 3. Now that's a general rule. It's not an absolute rule. Okay, it's a general guideline, but we think it's important to be rigorous enough to address our most critical issues, but parsimonious enough to make sure that what we come out with at the other end is going to be realistic and that we're going to be able to implement all of those action items. Okay, so how do we decide on these 3 strategic areas? We suggest sometimes that organizations want to do voting. We call this the nominal group technique. It's depicted in the picture on your screen, where we just draw up a ballot on a whiteboard or on a chart, and we have people come up and vote. Sometimes we use weighted votes, so we can identify which strategic areas do we want to address as an organization. We think there's actually a better way, and that's called consensus. In consensus, the bottom line is that everyone generally agrees or can at least live with the decision that we come up with. So consensus can oftentimes be reached pretty quickly, actually. That's been our experience, is that about 80 or 90% of the time, when you have the people go back to their small groups and they identify 2 or 3 strategic questions, what we find is that at most tables, they're addressing similar kinds of questions, and that it just takes a little bit of facilitation of the large group discussion to come up with 2 or 3 strategic areas that everybody can agree upon. It takes a little bit of time and a little bit of discussion, but quite frankly, most people know what those strategic areas are. especially if they've taken the time to do their homework and go through the SWOT analysis and reflect on what's urgent and what's important. Step 5 is answer the questions that we came up with in the previous step. These are the how can we questions. Okay, so for example, we came up with the how can we questions of like how can we reach out to more young families. Okay, if that was our question at this point, what we would do is we would have that question at the top of a chart, and we would ask people to brainstorm about possible ways of answering that question. How can we reach out to, how can we involve more young families in our business or in our organization? We oftentimes use conversation cafes to do this. So for example, you put that how can we question at the top of each chart, you have a table for each chart, and you rotate people through each table so that they begin to identify possible ways of answering that question, and they use those colored markers so we can identify, who wrote what on which table, and we can go back and clarify what's been written. But eventually then people rotate back to their original table, and we ask that small group to identify 2 or 3 themes in the data. And those become the draft of possible strategies for the strategic plan. Okay, I say draft of because we have to test that for consensus. Okay, so we usually ask people then at each small group to, after we've done the conversation cafes and the small groups have come up with the 2 or 3 themes in the data, then we ask them to present that to the large group and come to consensus about those 2 or 3 themes, which become the strategies for the strategic areas. For example, let's say we're doing strategic planning for a public park. And the strategic question is, how can we get more people into our park? Well, some possible strategies might be, number 1, maybe we're going to hold some more special events in the park. Number 2, maybe we need to plant more trees because, we've lost a lot of trees to storms in the last few years. Or number 3 might be, let's do some better marketing of this park. Nobody knows about all the things that we're doing in the park. All right, again, we want to make sure that the number of strategies and action steps that we come up with fit this paradigm of 3 times 3 times 3 that get us to the 27. So as we're setting the strategies, we want to make sure that we are limiting ourselves to roughly 2 or 3 strategies per strategic area. Okay, so those strategies are going to be aligned with each strategic goal, and that's going to lead us into the next step, which will be trying to identify action steps for each. So let's get specific. This is step 6. This is where the rubber meets the road. This is where we come up with our action plan for year 1. Every strategic plan needs to have an action plan, which is what are we going to do in the first year? Action plan looks like this. Okay, so we talked about strategic goals for that park, remember? So the strategic goal was we want to get more people into the park. And remember, we had strategies. One was special events, one was planting trees, and one was better marketing of our park. Okay, so now we would write all that into number 1, and 1.1 would be perhaps hold special events. 1.2 would be plant more trees. 1.3 would be market the park. Okay, so we would have all that written in, and we would have small groups work on filling in the blanks. So for example, 1.1.1 would be a specific action step that could be done to try to hold some kind of special event in the park, and we would name a person who's going to be responsible for that action step, and we would have a timeline of either 3, 6, 9, or 12 months for each of these action steps. So we've got roughly 9 action steps that we're going to come up with for each strategic area, roughly 3 action steps under each strategy. Some examples. Okay, so let's take that example of the park. Remember, under strategy number 1 was holding special events. So maybe an action step might be Bill's going to organize yoga in the park, and he's going to have that organized in the next 3 months. Okay, strategy number 2 was planting more trees. So Mary is going to set up some kind of tree planting event, and she's going to have that done in 6 months. And remember, strategy number 3 for our park was to do better marketing. So Sue's going to take the lead and set up some advertising on public radio. And she might have that done, say, in 9 months, okay? Those are some examples of the kind of action steps that might go on your strategic plan. Again, those action steps fit under the strategies. The strategies fit underneath the strategic goals, and this provides us with what we call our strategic cascade. Now, writing up the action steps, it's very important to have the right people in the room. You need a good mix of leaders, followers, and managers. We need the managers there because they're going to be the ones who appropriate or make sure that we have resources behind each action step. They're the ones that are going to be supervising some of the people who are doing this work. Okay, so managers generally control the resources, and we need their approval. We need them involved, and we need them to really buy into the strategic plan. We also need leaders there. We need people who are going to challenge the process. We're going to need people who are going to create more of a sense of urgency about what's important. Okay, now managers can be leaders, and leaders can be managers. Okay, I don't mean to necessarily say that they're separate, but we also need to point out that there's a lot of authority that doesn't necessarily have leadership, and there's a lot of leadership that doesn't necessarily come from authority. So you can have authority without leadership, you can have leadership without authority. And thirdly, we need a good amount of followers there. These are maybe the people who are going to do some of the action. And these are the people who might have a unique perspective on what's going on in the organization. They see things that the rest of us don't see. Okay, maybe some frontline people. Okay, so we want the followers involved as well. And the more followers, managers, and leaders we get involved in the strategic planning process and writing up these action steps, the more buy-in we're going to get, and the more likely we are to actually implement these action steps. So the bottom line in the action steps is who's going to do what by when, and having a time period of 3, 6, 9, or 12 months attached to each action item. Now, if you tell me that I've got 2.5 years to get something done, I probably won't even start on it for, I don't know, maybe 1.5 years, 2 years. But if you tell me that in the next 6 or 9 months, we want you to take this step that's eventually going to get us to this other thing in 2.5 years, now I've got something I can start working on right away. Step 7, discover the vision. And we say discover because we think that we've already created the vision. Now we just need to discover what that was. So vision's about direction. The focus here is on the future. Where are we going as an organization? What direction do we want to take? And how will the world be different if we succeed in our strategic plan? Notice that we do the vision at the end. Now you can force vision into the beginning of a process like this. We used to do it that way. And what we found was that charismatic leaders and people in positions of authority would have a really good sense as to what their vision for the future of the organization was, and they would generally impose that vision on the rest of the group. We think that this process makes the vision more a process that's created by everyone in the strategic planning. So the ultimate vision question here is, how will the world be different if we succeed in our strategic plan? Now, there's 2 kinds of vision statements. Most people use the internal vision statement. If you go to visionstatement.com, you're going to see a lot of vision statements that say, we want to be number 1, or our vision is to be the premier this, that, or the other thing, or our vision is to be the best at what we do. Okay, something along those lines. That answers the question, how will the organization be different if we succeed in our strategic plan? But we think that the external vision question is a much more powerful question, and it's much more inspiring to people outside the organization. So when we write the vision statement, we ask people to go back to their tables in small groups, and we ask them to identify words or phrases that come to mind when they answer that ultimate vision question of how will the world be different if we succeed in our strategic plan. Then we usually collect all those particular words and phrases, we put them up on a board, and we have to ask people to vote on them before they leave. And then we delegate the writing of the vision statement to a small group of people. We happen to believe that wordsmithing is not a large group activity. It should be reserved and delegated to just a few people, and then brought back to the large group. when the strategic planning team reconvenes. Now, there's a difference between a shared vision and a charismatic vision. The charismatic vision is that which is articulated by the charismatic leaders in the organization. The shared vision is what we're talking about here. That's where you create the vision together. Now, we would suggest that it's important that charismatic leaders buy into the strategic plan and that they participate in the strategic planning process along with everyone else. And it's also important that those charismatic leaders at the end of the process are able to, having listened to the people, that they're able to articulate and communicate that new vision to the organization and to people outside the organization. Step 8, hold yourself accountable. Anything worth planning is worth implementing. So now that we've gone through these 7 steps and we've got a strategic plan, we want to make sure that we implement it. We suggest that people hold an accountability session every 3 to 6 months. And we try to take the guilt out of the room and the blame out of the room by just congratulating the organization, first of all. Just the very fact that they're having this kind of accountability session puts them into an elite group, because quite frankly, 70 or 80% of organizations that do strategic planning never look at the plan again. In fact, they're so embarrassed about the fact that they aren't doing the things they said they were going to do that they don't pull it out, and they don't get the strategic planning team back together. They don't reconvene to look at the action items. So we start out the accountability session, first of all, just by congratulating them by having the humility to look at the strategic plan again. And so what we do is we ask them to look at each action step whose time has expired, and we have 3 choices for each step. Okay, we can archive things that have been done. Okay, and then we ask ourselves, what's the next step in moving toward that strategy? We might eliminate certain action steps from the plan. Maybe we decided to put a billboard up on Route 80, and now we realize that that was way too expensive. So we're going to eliminate that particular action item and replace it with something else. Or we might simply update a strategic plan with a new name, a new action item, or maybe a new timeline. Bottom line here is, organizations, we need to continuously improve. As we implement our strategic plan, we need to continuously update it and look at what's changing in our environment so that we can continuously adapt to those changes in the environment and continually think strategically about what's going on in our world. An example of this might be a football team. Okay, so let's suggest that a football team, before the game, gets together, the players and coaches, and they come up with a plan of attack for the football game. Okay, then they enter into the game, and let's say perhaps the wind changes directions, or maybe a key player goes down with an injury, or the other team comes up with certain strategies that we didn't anticipate, and we've got to adjust. Okay, all of these are what we call strategic thinking. That's what takes place after strategic planning ends. Okay, it's continuous. All right, so those are the 8 steps of our strategic planning model. If you have any questions, you can email me at ebener1977@msn.com. I'd be glad to interact with you, answer any questions, or hear your comments about this particular presentation. You might also want to go to our website that we've created just for this book, www.strategicplanningforleaders.com. So, thank you very much for paying attention to these slides, and good luck with your strategic planning.